Well, hello. My name is Rebekah Coffman, and I am here today for the Religion, Art, and Technology Lab project that we've called Tangible, Intangible. And I am, well, very, very excited to introduce two guests with me today. So we have Kenda Zellner-Smith and Kassie Bradshaw Kmitch. Kenda is the founder of Save the Boards Minneapolis, which is a grassroots preservation organization that started in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And Kassie is an archaeologist and turned 3D scanner. And both of them are going to be talking to us about what that's meant for them as preservationists and how that's informed their work. So I might just start with Kenda. I would love for you to just maybe give us a short introduction to you, to your background, maybe what brought you into preservation work, and especially something that's been kind of so all-encompassing in terms
Yeah,
of, yeah.
yeah. So my name is Kenda. I have lived Southside Minneapolis my entire life. Um, I personally don't come from, I don't create art. I've never really considered myself an artist that's creating paintings or murals or pictures. Both my sisters are extremely artistic and creative though. And since I was younger, I've always kind of been drawn to street art. We have cameras from when I was in like middle school, elementary school, and the cards are just filled with pictures of graffiti on walls, on trains. And so I think when the boards came out after the murder of George Floyd, immediately I just had a pull to them. And then I started thinking about what happens if, they disappear. And so that's kind of where I jumped into action in collecting them. I used my dad's pickup truck most evenings and I'd collect with my roommate. And it kind of turned into a sense of healing for me. I think that's how I kind of coped with what was going on last summer in that experience. And then outside of that, I just graduated college. I was working a full-time job in a nursing home while doing this work. So I was kind of doing two full-time jobs at the same time. But yeah, I just jumped into it with no real background in organizing, especially at the level and the capacity that I now am. And it's just been kind of a learning process as I go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to say it's been a wild ride and a year and a half is probably an understatement, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you can share a little bit. So that's how the project got started. What has been kind of, in addition, I know you said you've been collecting boards, and what does that look like in terms of like preservation, or what are different activation things that you do as part of the project?
Yeah. And so just, in the project, there's been so many people that I've met, and, networked with, Rebekah being one, Kassie being another. And so from the very beginning of this project, I remember getting in touch with Kassie and, Kassie kind of just throwing out this idea about, hey, if you're ever interested, I've already scanned some stuff, but I'd love to scan whatever you're collecting. And as I continued to collect, um, that just sat with me and it just only grew stronger over time, which was making sure that they could be documented in a digital way, that would allow them to live on longer than the physical pieces of the boards. And when I first started doing this work, that didn't cross my mind until someone like Kassie kind of planted that seed. And then other conversations just kind of nurtured that thought and idea. And so since then, the group of us and others have been exploring what the virtual and the augmented reality world of, preservation and protest art might look like.
Yeah, because I think an important part of your project, and that's why I thought this would be such a great um, thing to have as part of this tangible and tangible is, you are doing physical preservation. And I don't know if you've described the boards that you're preserving, but they're, I mean, big pieces of street art,
Mhm.
right? Like they're not little things that you could just put in a room or a car easily. It's like these huge things.
Than you.
Um, yeah, like big plywood murals. Um, and in addition to the physical preservation, doing this almost like in tandem digital thing. Um, and I think it's something that a lot of people are navigating in preservation right now, which is what does that mean for us? Is augmented reality the new preservation? Because, in climate change, there are sites that are just going to get lost. We can't physically preserve them.
Mhm.
Or financially, we just can't financially reuse this building sustainably. We need to just change it. What if we scan it and in the meantime, that's our
Mhm.
preservation and it
Yeah.
allows for change? And what you're talking about, and maybe you can explain a little more, is in this case, it's more about the boards themselves aren't sustainable because of just like the nature of plywood art.
Mhm.
And what have you kind of learned through that process of preserving
Yeah.
something, knowing it's not going to stay forever?
I think at the beginning, I didn't think it wasn't going to stay forever. I would talk about how I wanted to see this artwork around forever. I, specifically remember saying in 10 years, when I have a child, I'd love to have, a space that my kid can go and see these boards that I was walking up and down the streets, during these marches and these protests seeing. But that's just not realistic. And as time has gone on and as I've touched more and more boards and really taken in their physical nature and the differences in them, and really given more power to the moment of they weren't created to last forever. A lot of artists created them they were a reaction, they were a response to an action. And so that's kind of where we've continued to explore how do we value the life and death of the physical pieces of this art. And in valuing the life, I think that's where we are transitioning into that virtual reality piece of things. And then letting, physical boards, they won't remain forever. Every single show we bring them out to, they chip. When you're moving them in trucks, you're sliding them next to each other, you're restacking them. Every single time, they're starting to deteriorate more and more and more. And at the beginning, I just didn't realize that's what was happening to them. After you go through a year of being in Minnesota and having just the cold weather, getting boards that were out, in the middle of winter, and then you treated them and trying to care for them. You really get to know each board. They're all individual. There can be a family of 7, but each board in that family is different. Some of them are more warped than others. But yeah, we've just been really trying to learn about each piece and what's best for each piece in its current state and long term. And that's just kind of where we're going from there. There's no real direction that I think we're taking. I think it's just in the moment what makes the most sense for the boards. What do we have the capacity to do, and how do we still, while preserving them, make sure that the community is a part of the conversation, a part of the decision making, has the option to see the boards, that they're still accessible, not making sure they're not just stuck in a warehouse while we're, this year scanning them, organizing and documenting them, but still, participating in shows and events and facilitating those conversations. Because as you mentioned, the storage piece of it, trying to have funds to support these big pieces of artwork and history, it's really hard. And it's something that's brand new to even people that have done preservation work long before it even, I thought about it. So yeah.
No, I mean, that's so much to try to keep in balance. Just hearing you even talk about it, where it's like, okay, here's all these physical things and these things that, let's say, museums or let's say preservationists already know are issues, right? Storage, budgets, sustainable community programming, volunteers and burnout, like all of that's real. And then you're complementing that with like this whole new side of things that people are still figuring out, right? Where it's like, nobody really knows what to do with 3D scans long term, but we think that there's a really cool possibility for them. Or, is a virtual museum the same as a physical museum? Because I know in hearing you talk about the project, something that's been really forefront for you is the importance of keeping the boards in the Minneapolis community. And so, how have you thought about kind of bridging that, where using this like really physical presence that has these, really strong kind of visceral ties to a thing in a place that's meant to be there, with this like digital realm, and how do you share that? Is that something that you've been doing in projects?
Yeah. So one project, and Kassie, I'd love for you to speak a little bit more to this, but Voma Space is a project that me and Kassie collaborated on with Lee Cavalier. And he is London based, or the museum is London based or UK based. But it's the first completely online art museum. And so Kassie, worked on scans before we were even, in partnership trying to scan together. And we got some scans done together, and she sent those over to Lee so they could be modeled on their platform and shared. And for us, it's really important that we're able to do that, because we do want the boards that were created here, that were up on the businesses here in Minneapolis, to stay here. Taking them out of our community doesn't make sense. It's counterproductive. They don't belong outside of the community. They were made here for the community. And so really just honing in back on that point and figuring out, so how do we still continue the conversation, because other people deserve to see them. There are people that lived in Minneapolis and relocated, or people that, grew up their lives here, but relocated in recent years. and they'd still like to know what happened in their city. They had to watch from social media and see their friends and families in the neighborhoods just burning down and feeling helpless. And so kind of creating that space for these boards to exist alleviates that. It lets people still be a part of those conversations, but then the physical pieces are still here. They still represent the solidarity here, the pain, the trauma that we're still working through here. And I think that's really important. That we haven't seen a lot of change and people are still struggling. Organizers are still dealing with burnout. It's just a cycle that's continued. And so making sure that these physical boards that really touched different people and really kind of helped people get through last summer, they stay here, because I think that's the best way to utilize them. And yeah, Kassie, if you want to jump in a little bit about
Sure.
Voma, just what that means to us and why we're so passionate about, kind of cultivating, space online and, why that matters to us.
Yeah, I think of it as outreach. How can we get the most people to experience these artworks and protest pieces as possible? Not everyone can afford, if they're not from the community, not everyone can afford, especially now in the global pandemic, to fly here and visit some place like the George Floyd Memorial on their own, or visit Save the Boards. But the 3D scan allows these high resolution images to exist in the digital space for everybody. And it just kind of gets the work out there. It activates the pieces to a wider audience. And then, like Kenda was saying, the physical boards are staying in the community, in the stewardship of the people and the culture bearers and the organizations that should have those boards. And there's also a really big difference between the protest pieces and the street art and the tags that happen immediately after George Floyd's murder, and then the summer of 2020, and then now a year later, over a year later, 2021. So the community really used art as a form of protest and also as a form of healing. And those 3D scans sort of are a way that people outside the community can go on the journey with us.
Well, and I think you used a really key word, which was stewardship. And it's something, I've heard you use as well, Kenda. But it's this idea that who owns the boards, right? Like, what does ownership mean in this context? Versus, and also true of the scans, right? Who owns scans? Is that something that is proprietary? Is that copyrighted? Or is that open source and available to everyone? And how is that something you've navigated with kind of the digital realm and physical realm? So these ideas of like stewardship and ownership. And
yeah. From the beginning, when I approached it, I always wanted these scans to be available for everybody, especially the community, especially the artists who created the work. If we can connect them, if we can connect an artist to their street art, sometimes for obvious reasons, people want to remain anonymous or want to be disconnected from the work that they created. But sometimes there are, professional artists that have put their name on their pieces and do want people to know that they made them. And so definitely, for sure, when always on the forefront is these scans are for everybody and everyone should have access to them and everyone should be able to see them.
And just tagging off of that, I feel strongly that no one owns these boards. Save the boards, we save them, we collect them, you document them with the intention of redistributing them and activating them back into community spaces. So we don't own them. Artists, I think have the most say on what they would want to be done with their pieces. If, again, they like to be a part of the conversations. We've had the reoccurring theme of artists not really wanting, to have that voice. But we always want to touch back on this. Art wouldn't exist without Black murder. A Black man was murdered. People didn't just get out on the streets in Minneapolis and make art one day for the heck of it, for all of our community to enjoy. A life was stolen. It was on video, and so that's why I don't think anybody owns it. Our community owns it. The Black struggle owns that art and the healing that it can give us and the tools of reflection and learning that it can give us. That's what we own. But those pieces are their history, their artifacts. And I think it gets really really layered when you talk about who owns them, because that kind of leads into the next conversation on who created them. You know, a lot of those boards weren't created by Black artists. A lot of Black people, you know, last summer weren't out on the streets painting rainbows and colorful murals, you know, talking about having a better tomorrow or standing in solidarity with one another. That wasn't the case. And so it touches just back on this art was created out of Black murder, and who are the artists behind a lot of the art that people are talking about saving or just start at the forefront of this conversation. And then how do we dive in deeper and look at, well, let's look at the art that's down further on Lake Street, the art that's happening during the uprising. Who created those pieces? Will we ever know? The art that's not colorful and pretty, is that going to be saved? And if so, or if not, why? You know, just kind of examining all the different facets that this art presents us with, and just giving intentional space behind that, I think, in conversation.
And there's also sort of a bias, I guess, on public perception of the art. You know, a lot of this art is in the public space. It's street art. It's out there interacting with the public, and the pieces that maybe aren't, I don't like using that term, but maybe aren't as nice or aren't as pretty or don't necessarily have a feel-good message, those pieces disappear from that landscape the fastest. And so there are pieces that I've 3D scanned that don't exist anymore. They've been tagged over, or maybe the city has painted over them, or maybe whether they just weren't preserved as well as maybe a different piece that looked a certain way or had a certain message associated with it. And so now the 3D scan might be the best existing version of that piece that exists now.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that maybe opens up another set of questions I've had, just thinking, you know, this is like an incredible arc of a story of what's happened over the last year and a half. And I think you've both touched on a lot of the issues or themes of, you know, this difference between something that's like physical and present and lived experience, and then conveying that message effectively, or, you know, trying to address all these really messy gray areas within that work that I think it's protest, right? Like protest is something active, it's something physical, it's something experienced. And it's not something that's usually meant to be preserved because it's a moment, right? And yet here you are preserving moments. Mm-hmm. And just thinking about that going forward, you know, what would you see the role of an organization like Save the Boards in that, you know, in terms of if the word's reactivating, if the word is, you know, public programming outreach, you know, what is kind of the next step you would like to see in terms of kind of creating this message for the future?
Yeah, it's definitely just creating a platform that reaches a larger audience. You know, again, Kassie said it before, sometimes people aren't ready to be a part of conversations or help facilitate change unless they can somewhat resonate or, you know, have a piece of your experience that they can, you know, that they align with, or, you know, they can just connect with. And so I think when we talk about virtual reality, we're dabbling in areas that we can really set up environments that people can experience as close as they can what it's like being Black in America. It will never be the same, you know, it's scratching the surface of it, but I think and that's just one thing. I think there's many different avenues that can be explored that would help leverage conversations and leverage people to feel like, no, I need to do this, because in this situation, the outcome would not be the same for my family versus a Black family. And that would most likely be a fatal outcome, you know, really putting it out there where it's easy for people to receive it and digest it and hopefully want to help make change. I think that's the biggest thing. And just reaching more people. Many people in Minneapolis, we know what went on here. We know how we stood together. We know how after, you know, some of those nights, the next morning you'd see people on the street painting, coming together, protecting businesses, crowdfunding, you know, doing supply drives everywhere. That wasn't boosted all over the nation. That was just what we knew we were doing here as a community. And so making sure that we create a platform where this conversation reaches everybody, because God forbid it happens again, we'll have a platform that now we can really highlight, this is what's going on, this is how it's going on, the narrative matters, the Black voices matter, Black journalists matter. And so I think AR and VR and just finding that platform is just the first stepping stone to making sure as the cycle continues, our voices are heard and we don't have to burn down a city to make them heard. And I think it was necessary what happened in Minneapolis last summer because it caught everybody's attention, the world's attention. But how do we do that again without hurting ourselves, without taking away from ourselves? Because we were desperate. We were pleading for people to hear and to feel what we think augmented reality and virtual reality might just be scratching the surface of how we can still do that without, physically, putting our community in a position to have to dig itself out of a hole that we didn't ask to be in.
Yeah, a lot to weigh. Doesn't fit nicely on a t-shirt on the mission statement sometimes, does it?
No, not at all.
Our mission is to stay alive, and that's sometimes enough, right? Let alone respect and voice, right? Well, I realize that we are at the end of our time, but I want to thank you both so much for sharing. Kenda, especially, thank you for sharing the vision for Save the Boards with us. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more about the project in time.
Thank you.
Thanks.